In the glittering courts of Renaissance Europe, where kings traded crowns like playing cards and every marriage could change the fate of continents, one family ruled above them all. Their bloodline stretched across empires, from Spain to Austria, from the Holy Roman throne to the far corners of the New World. They were called the Habsburgs, the most powerful dynasty the world had ever seen. For centuries, they didn't just rule kingdoms, they owned them through love, loyalty, and a dangerous kind of logic: keep the blood pure, keep the power pure. But nature doesn't bend to politics. What began as brilliant strategy soon twisted into something far darker. Generation after generation, their royal marriages tightened the genetic circle, until their children inherited not power, but weakness. At the heart of this tragedy stands one man, King Charles II of Spain, the last of his line. A ruler so frail he could barely speak or eat, so lonely he was said to be bewitched. His curse wasn't cast by witches, it was written in his DNA. This is not just a story about kings and queens. It's a story about biology, ambition, and the price of believing you can cheat nature itself. So, what happens when a family becomes too royal for its own survival? When the quest for divine blood turns into a death sentence? Welcome to the haunting legacy of the Habsburg dynasty. Our story begins not in a glittering palace, but on a cold, misty hillside in 10th century Switzerland. Here, a small stone fortress stood watch over the Rhine River Valley, a modest stronghold called Habsburg, or Hawk's Castle. No one then could have imagined that this unremarkable outpost would give its name to a dynasty that would one day rule half the known world. But that's where it all began, with the Habsburgs, a family whose ambition would reach the heavens and whose downfall would be written in their blood. In the Middle Ages, Europe was a chessboard of ambition. Power didn't come from factories or parliaments, it came from land, armies, and above all, marriage. To marry was to merge, to fuse wealth, territory, and influence into something larger than blood alone. And the Habsburgs, shrewd and strategic, understood this better than anyone. While other noble families drew swords to gain power, the Habsburgs learned to draw up contracts. They perfected a kind of royal arithmetic: one marriage equals one new province, one alliance, one step closer to the crown. By the late 1200s, their patience paid off. In 1273, Rudolf of Habsburg, a man of sharp wit and steady temper, was elected king of the Romans, effectively making him ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a turning point that transformed a provincial Swiss noble house into a royal dynasty. From that moment, the Habsburg name was no longer just local, it was imperial. And their motto began to reflect that ambition: Bella gerent alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry. That simple line captured a genius strategy, and a fatal flaw. Through centuries of political marriages, the Habsburgs would build an empire so vast, so interconnected, that it became the envy of the world. But in that same strategy lay the seed of their destruction. Still, in the beginning, it worked beautifully. Generation after generation, they expanded through marital alliances rather than conquests. Their family crest spread like vines across the map of Europe, entwining Austria, Bohemia, Burgundy, Hungary, Spain, Portugal, and beyond. At the dawn of the 16th century, one Habsburg stood above them all, Emperor Maximilian I. He was clever, cultured, and visionary, the kind of monarch who could see history unfolding decades ahead. While kings like Henry VIII or Francis I fought endless wars to prove their strength, Maximilian saw a different path: diplomacy by marriage. In 1496, he arranged one of the most consequential unions in European history, the marriage of his son, Philip the Handsome, to Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of Spain. That single marriage was like fusing two suns together. It brought the entire Spanish crown, and all of its vast overseas colonies, into the Habsburg orbit. From that point, the family's reach extended from the snowy Alps to the jungles of the New World. Maximilian didn't need to invade, he inherited. He used love the way others used war. Imagine the map of Europe around 1500. Every color, every border, every flag connected somehow to one family, the Habsburgs. Their influence wasn't just political, it was spiritual. They were defenders of the Catholic faith, champions of the Church, protectors of divine order. At least, that's what they told themselves. In truth, it was about control of the crown, the Church, and the narrative of power itself. When Maximilian's grandson Charles V inherited the throne, he became the most powerful ruler on earth. From his mother, Joanna, he inherited Spain and its gold-filled colonies in the Americas. From his father, Philip, he gained the Holy Roman Empire and Austria. From his Burgundian ancestors, he received the wealthy Netherlands and Flanders. It was said that Charles ruled an empire on which the sun never set. His ships crossed the Atlantic, his soldiers marched across Italy, his coins flowed through every port in Europe. But as the Habsburgs rose higher, the pressures of holding such a vast and fractured realm grew unbearable. The empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Carpathians, from the Mediterranean to the New World. Governing it was like trying to hold water in your hands. To keep this enormous machine running, the Habsburgs turned ever more inward. They came to believe that their blood itself carried divine authority, that only a Habsburg could truly rule what they had built. And so, instead of looking outward for alliances, they began to look inward, to themselves. What started as a clever survival tactic, marrying for power, slowly transformed into a dangerous obsession, the belief that purity of blood equaled purity of rule. At first, the effects weren't obvious. The early marriages between distant cousins or allied royals didn't seem unusual, all noble houses did it. But the Habsburgs went further than anyone else. They married within their own line, cousins, uncles, nieces, to an extent unprecedented in European history. Every new generation became a tighter circle, a smaller gene pool, and an increasingly fragile foundation beneath the weight of empire. Still, for the moment, the surface glittered. Palaces gleamed. Marriages brought crowns. The royal portraits showed perfection, elegant faces, silken robes, and golden crowns. But hidden beneath the powdered wigs and fine lace were the first hints of deformity, small signs that something was wrong. The famous Habsburg jaw, the slight droop of the lower lip, the elongated chin, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The family brushed it off as coincidence, or even as a mark of nobility. But nature doesn't lie. And soon, the consequences of centuries of internal breeding would reveal themselves in full. The irony is haunting. The very tactic that made the Habsburgs great, the marriages that brought them power, also became their undoing. They believed they could outsmart history, that they could preserve perfection by keeping their lineage pure. In doing so, they created one of the most famous genetic case studies in all of human history. The empire that had conquered through love and diplomacy was quietly sowing the seeds of its biological destruction. And at the end of that long, glittering line would stand a king who embodied every flaw, every mutation, every curse born of centuries of ambition. His name was Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg of his branch, a man both tragic and symbolic, the living proof that no amount of power can rewrite the laws of nature. From a humble fortress in the Alps to a golden throne in Madrid, the Habsburgs built their empire not on conquest, but on calculation. They married nations together. They turned family into politics and politics into destiny. But destiny has its own laws, and when you challenge nature itself, there is always a price. As the 16th century unfolded, the Habsburgs stood at the peak of their glory. Their empire stretched across oceans, their bloodline linked half the thrones of Europe, and their banners flew from Vienna to Madrid, from Brussels to Naples, from the New World to the heart of the old continent. Yet behind the glitter of power, something was quietly changing. What had once been a brilliant political strategy, marrying for alliances, was slowly mutating into an obsession that would consume the dynasty from within. The shift was subtle at first. Early Habsburg marriages had been clever tools of diplomacy, sealing peace treaties and strengthening claims to contested lands. But by the mid-1500s, the family had grown so vast and so dominant that they no longer needed new alliances, they already owned most of Europe. And so, in the name of preserving what they had built, the royal advisors began to favor safe matches, marriages within the family, to ensure that no foreign prince or princess could dilute their claim to power. The reasoning seemed logical at the time: keep the bloodline pure, and the empire would remain pure. But what they could not see was that in doing so, they were setting a trap that would close around them generation by generation. In palaces across Vienna, Madrid, and Prague, portraits of royal couples began to look eerily similar. The same sharp chin, the same elongated jawline, the same heavy lower lip, it was as though the same face kept reappearing, painted again and again in royal regalia. Courtiers whispered that the Habsburg look was a mark of majesty, a divine signature that proved their noble origins. But the truth was far less flattering: it was the first visible sign of genetic collapse. Under Emperor Charles V and his successors, the practice of endogamy, marrying within the same family, became a matter of policy. Charles himself married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, a match that united the Spanish and Austrian lines even more tightly. His son, Philip II, repeated the pattern, marrying his first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal, and later his niece, Anna of Austria. Each new generation drew from the same narrow pool of genes, reducing the natural diversity that keeps families healthy. The royal physicians began to notice troubling patterns among the children of these unions: weakness, frailty, strange deformities that defied explanation. But their warnings were ignored. The Church had approved the marriages, the Pope had blessed them. If God permitted it, who were mortals to object? The Habsburgs believed their blood was sacred, chosen by divine right. They saw no danger in concentrating it further. To question the purity of their lineage was to question the will of heaven itself. At court, it was easier to believe in miracles than in medicine. When royal infants were born sickly, courtiers blamed witches or curses. When kings grew unstable or infertile, priests prescribed prayers, not science. Yet beneath the rituals and incense, the mathematics of genetics continued its relentless work. Every close marriage doubled the chance of harmful genes meeting. Every generation made it harder to escape the invisible spiral closing around them. By the time Philip III took the throne, the signs of degeneration were impossible to ignore. He was a quiet man, gentle but indecisive, often plagued by illness. His son, Philip IV, shared the same delicate constitution but added to it a fiery temper and a restlessness that seemed to burn from within. When Philip IV's first wife, Elizabeth of France, died, he turned once again to his own bloodline and married his niece, Mariana of Austria. She was 30 years younger than him and, like so many of their kin, already descended from a web of cousin unions. Their child would be the ultimate result of centuries of genetic narrowing, a king whose body and mind would bear the full weight of dynastic ambition. But in those early days, no one saw the doom coming. The empire still glittered. The Spanish court dazzled with its golden age of art and wealth. Velázquez painted the royal family in luminous tones, hiding the sickness behind elegance and silk. The empire's colonies brought in silver from Peru and Mexico, spices from the East, and faith from the Vatican. Outwardly, the Habsburgs seemed invincible. Yet their strength was hollow, like a grand cathedral built on crumbling stone. Behind closed doors, royal marriages grew increasingly desperate. Each generation faced the same dilemma: marry outside the family and risk losing political unity, or marry inside and risk physical decline. Again and again, they chose blood over biology. Political unity mattered more than health, divine right mattered more than human nature. Even as advisors quietly suggested alliances with other noble houses, the idea was dismissed. To mix their blood was unthinkable. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate through the courts of Europe. Diplomats from France and England mocked the House of the Jaw. Artists and scholars recorded the peculiar features that seemed to define the Habsburgs: the protruding chin, the drooping lower lip, the sluggish speech. In private, physicians described the royal children as pale, slow, and often infertile. But no one dared to say the truth aloud: the most powerful family in Europe was poisoning itself through its own pride. In Austria, the same story unfolded with quieter tragedy. Archdukes and archduchesses, bound by duty, married cousins they barely knew. Some died in childbirth, others went mad or wasted away from unknown illnesses. Still, the lineage continued, bound by the belief that God favored their purity. By the late 1600s, the Habsburg bloodline was like a candle burning at both ends. The Spanish branch, ruled by Philip IV, had produced a single surviving son, Charles II. The Austrian branch, meanwhile, faced its own struggles with infertility and early deaths. The empire that once expanded through clever diplomacy now contracted under the weight of its own biology. And yet, the royal propaganda machine kept spinning. Court painters presented idealized portraits of healthy princes and radiant queens. The clergy preached that the Habsburgs were chosen by heaven itself, destined to rule forever. The truth remained hidden behind gold and marble, but the cracks were already spreading. By now, the genetic spiral was irreversible. The average Habsburg child carried more overlapping genes than nature could bear. Diseases that would have been rare in a normal population became common in their family. Doctors recorded deformities of the jaw and skull, seizures, infertility, and mental instability. The Habsburg jaw, once seen as a mark of royal identity, had become a grotesque reminder of how far the family had pushed against the limits of nature. Still, the marriages continued. Each union was another turn of the screw, another gamble with fate. Each wedding ceremony, filled with hymns, blessings, and solemn vows, masked the reality that the empire was breeding itself toward extinction. The same portraits that once symbolized victory now looked like warnings, their beauty concealing quiet decay. By the end of the 17th century, the dynasty that had ruled for 6 centuries was running out of time. The Spanish Habsburgs, once masters of half the world, were down to one fragile, sickly heir. The Austrian line would linger longer, but the damage had been done. The empire's greatest strength, its unity, its bloodline, had become its curse. The age of ambition had become the age of obsession. What had started as a brilliant chess game of diplomacy had turned into a closed loop of madness, deformity, and death. The Habsburgs had tried to cheat history by keeping their blood pure. But history, like nature, cannot be outsmarted. And soon, one man would bear the full cost of that arrogance, a king whose every breath was a struggle, whose every moment of life testified to the silent catastrophe written in his DNA. His name would echo through time as the symbol of the dynasty's downfall, Charles II of Spain.
By the time the 17th century reached its troubled middle, the Habsburgs had become prisoners of their own legend. Their banners still hung across Europe, their palaces still gleamed with gold, and their titles filled entire pages. Yet beneath the crowns and ceremonies, something was breaking. The empire was not under siege by armies or revolutions, it was being eaten from within, cell by cell, gene by gene. What had begun as a political calculation was now a biological reckoning. Nature had begun to demand payment for centuries of defiance. The power of the Habsburgs once seemed eternal. For generations, they had ruled with the quiet confidence of those who believed themselves chosen by God. But divine favor could not rewrite the laws of inheritance. The more they intermarried, the smaller their genetic world became, until each new birth was a roll of loaded dice. The results were increasingly cruel. Infants were born sickly and died within months. Young princes grew into adulthood plagued by seizures, tremors, or mental fog. Some could barely chew their food. Others could not father children at all. At the heart of this crisis was one simple truth that no priest or politician dared to speak: the Habsburgs were running out of genetic room to maneuver. Centuries of marrying cousins, uncles, and nieces had produced an inbreeding coefficient so high that it would horrify modern geneticists. Every noble wedding meant fewer healthy possibilities for the next generation. Each royal match, celebrated with hymns and fireworks, carried within it a hidden equation, one that added up to disaster. For most of history, no one understood how this worked. The science of genetics was still centuries away. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen the pattern. When unrelated parents have children, their genes combine in new ways. Weaknesses are often balanced by strengths, harmful mutations are hidden by diversity. But when parents share too many ancestors, the opposite happens. Harmful recessive genes, once rare and silent, begin to meet their twins. The result is predictable: deformities, disease, infertility, and decline. Among the Habsburgs, this invisible arithmetic reached terrifying extremes. Historians and modern geneticists later calculated what the family never could. The inbreeding coefficient, known as F, measures how likely it is that a person inherits identical copies of a gene from both parents. In normal populations, that number hovers near 0. For the child of first cousins, it rises to about 0.0625. For the child of siblings, it is 0.25. But for King Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg monarch, that number reached 0.254, higher than if his parents had been brother and sister. It was as if the entire family's past had condensed into his blood. The tragedy of Charles II began long before he was born. His father, Philip IV, had already shown signs of the family's genetic strain: his jaw protruded, his speech slurred, his body frail. His wife, Mariana of Austria, was not just his queen, she was also his niece, sharing ancestors on both sides. Their marriage was meant to preserve the dynasty. Instead, it sealed its fate. When Charles entered the world in 1661, the court erupted in celebration. Bells rang across Madrid, priests proclaimed divine blessing, and poets compared the newborn prince to Solomon and Alexander. But as the months passed, joy turned to unease. The infant did not grow like other children. His head was large, his limbs thin, his eyes dull and wandering. He struggled to feed, often choking on his milk. Doctors prescribed prayers, relics, and elaborate diets. None of it helped. As Charles grew, so did his problems. He could not walk without assistance until the age of 8, nor speak clearly until he was 4. His tongue was so large it barely fit his mouth, forcing him to drool constantly. His jaw jutted forward grotesquely, making it difficult to chew or close his lips. He suffered from seizures, tremors, and sudden collapses that terrified the palace. Every day, the evidence of the dynasty's decay was written across his body. The Spanish court, steeped in superstition, refused to accept a scientific explanation: there was no such thing yet. Instead, they whispered that the boy was cursed. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Priests performed exorcisms in candlelit chambers, muttering prayers over his trembling form. The blame shifted from witchcraft to divine punishment to bad omens. But no one dared to acknowledge the truth: the curse was hereditary, and it came from within the royal blood itself. Charles's education was symbolic of his condition. Tutors tried to teach him Latin, philosophy, and statecraft, but he could barely concentrate for more than a few minutes. He repeated lessons like a child, often forgetting them moments later. The ministers and courtiers who surrounded him quickly learned to rule in his name, keeping him a puppet on the throne. His signature was shaky, his voice weak, his mind often elsewhere. Physically, he was barely capable of fulfilling the duties of a king. His posture was bent, his skin pale, and his health fragile. Every illness brought rumors of his imminent death. Yet somehow, Charles lingered, defying the odds year after year, as if trapped between life and extinction. The people pitied him, the nobles mocked him, and foreign diplomats watched with quiet dread. They knew that when he died, the greatest empire in Europe would fall into chaos. 2 marriages were arranged in the hope of producing an heir. The first, to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess, ended in heartbreak. She was beautiful, young, and full of life, a cruel contrast to her husband's deformities. She spent her brief reign weeping in loneliness and died childless at 26. The court whispered that she had been poisoned, but the truth was simpler: the king could not consummate the marriage. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. Doctors, priests, and astrologers prescribed everything from herbal tonics to prayers to bizarre rituals involving animal organs. None of it worked. By the 1690s, the Spanish Empire, once the wealthiest on earth, was crumbling. Gold from the Americas no longer flowed as it once had. Wars, corruption, and debt drained the treasury. The king's weakness mirrored the state's decline. Both were pale imitations of former glory. The courtiers still dressed in silk and silver, but the palaces were hollow, echoing with the sound of decay. When Charles finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, the autopsy told a story more grotesque than any rumor. His body was deformed beyond belief. His heart was tiny and shriveled, his lungs corroded, his intestines putrefied. He had only one testicle, described as black as coal. The doctors who examined him must have realized, even if they lacked the words for it, that they were looking at the end of a bloodline. The king's death without an heir ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, plunging Europe into years of carnage. Armies marched, empires rose and fell, and the map of the continent was redrawn, all because one man, broken by centuries of inbreeding, could not produce a child. In modern times, scientists have confirmed what history suspected. Studies of the Habsburg genealogy show that as the family's inbreeding increased, the number of stillbirths, deformities, and infertility cases rose in direct proportion. Charles II was not merely unlucky, he was the mathematical conclusion of 2 centuries of genetic decline. His body, frail and twisted, became the ultimate proof that nature always collects its debts. The Habsburgs had tried to outwit biology with crowns, faith, and ceremony. But no divine right, no empire of gold, no army of priests could undo what their own choices had created. In the end, their collapse was not written by historians, it was written in their chromosomes. And so, with Charles's final breath, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty ended. The grand experiment in royal purity was over. The empire that once claimed the sun itself bowed to darkness. It was the quiet triumph of nature over pride, a lesson carved not into monuments or books, but into bone and blood. When Charles II died in 1700, the silence that fell over the royal palace of Madrid was heavier than any funeral bell. For more than 200 years, the Habsburgs had ruled Spain with absolute power, commanding armies, gold, and faith across continents. But all the splendor of their empire had come to rest on the frail shoulders of one man who could not speak clearly, walk steadily, or produce an heir. His death was not only the end of a life, it was the collapse of a dynasty. The last breath of Charles II marked the extinction of the Spanish Habsburgs and opened the door to one of the most devastating wars in European history. As word of the king's death spread, courtiers wept, priests prayed, and the streets of Madrid filled with murmurs of fear. Who would now sit on the Spanish throne? The empire Charles left behind was vast, stretching from Europe to the Americas, from the Philippines to the Caribbean. But without a direct heir, every kingdom, every territory, every crown jewel of the Habsburg inheritance was suddenly up for grabs. Before his death, Charles had changed his will several times, torn between rival powers that each sought to claim his empire. On one side stood the Austrian Habsburgs, his closest blood relatives, led by Emperor Leopold I. They argued that Spain should remain within the Habsburg family, united under the same divine lineage that had ruled for centuries. On the other side stood France, led by the ambitious King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, who wanted the Spanish crown for his grandson, Philip of Anjou. Both sides had legitimate claims through marriage and blood. Both were ready to fight. In his final days, weak and delirious, Charles made a choice that would set Europe on fire. Pressured by his advisors and terrified of seeing his empire torn apart, he named Philip of Anjou, the French prince, as his successor, on one condition, that France and Spain never be united under a single crown. It was a desperate attempt to maintain balance, but the decision pleased no one. To the Austrians, it was a betrayal. To the English and the Dutch, it was a threat. A Bourbon king on the Spanish throne meant that France would suddenly control nearly half of Europe's territories. Within months, alliances began to form. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German states joined together in what would be known as the Grand Alliance, opposing France and Spain. In 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession began, a brutal, continent-wide conflict that would last more than a decade. The war was not just about borders, it was about balance. If the Bourbons of France gained control of Spain, no other European power could hope to compete. The Habsburgs, despite their decline, refused to let go of what they saw as their divine inheritance. Across Europe, armies marched in the name of royal legitimacy and faith. Yet beneath the rhetoric of crowns and God, it was greed and fear that fueled the fires. The battles were vast and terrible. From the plains of Flanders to the hills of Italy, from the Pyrenees to the Danube, soldiers clashed in a war that drained nations dry. The Duke of Marlborough led English troops to victories at Blenheim and Ramillies. The Austrian general Prince Eugene of Savoy fought with brilliant ferocity, pushing back French advances in the heart of Europe. Villages burned, cities starved, and fields turned to mud and ash. It was a war of kings, but the people paid the price. Meanwhile, in Spain, the new young king, Philip V, struggled to rule an empire that was collapsing under its own weight. Though crowned with grandeur, he inherited a kingdom ravaged by famine, corruption, and exhaustion. The Spanish nobility was divided between those loyal to the old Habsburg name and those who saw in Philip a chance for renewal under the Bourbon dynasty. The church preached loyalty, but faith could not fill empty stomachs or stop bullets. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs refused to yield. Emperor Leopold I and his successors believed it was their sacred right to reclaim the Spanish crown. But even as they fought, they too suffered from the same rot that had destroyed their cousins. Generations of internal marriages had left the Austrian line weakened, plagued by infant deaths and recurring illness. Their soldiers fought bravely, but their empire was stretched thin. For more than 10 years, Europe bled. The war spread beyond the continent, into the colonies of the New World and the seas of the Caribbean. English and Dutch ships attacked Spanish ports, French privateers raided Atlantic convoys. The Habsburg dream of a unified, divine monarchy had turned into a global struggle for survival. By 1711, both sides were exhausted. Then, in a twist of fate, Emperor Joseph I of Austria, the Habsburg claimant to the Spanish throne, died suddenly of smallpox. His brother, Archduke Charles, who had been fighting to claim Spain, suddenly inherited the Austrian crown and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The very outcome Europe had feared now seemed inevitable. If the war continued, Charles could unite Austria and Spain under one rule, just as France might unite Spain and France. The nightmare of a single power dominating Europe threatened to become reality on both sides. The diplomats hurried to negotiate peace. After years of slaughter, compromise finally came through two major treaties, Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714. Under their terms, Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain, but he was forced to renounce any claim to the French throne, ensuring that the two kingdoms would remain separate. Austria received a bounty of Spanish possessions, the Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. Britain gained Gibraltar and Minorca, along with valuable trade rights in the Americas. The war had redrawn the map of Europe, but the cost was staggering. Historians estimate that between 400,000 and over 1 million people died, not counting the millions who suffered from famine, disease, and economic ruin. Entire regions were devastated, their populations scattered, their harvests gone. For Spain, the end of the war marked the end of its golden age. Though Philip V brought stability, the empire's vast wealth had already slipped away. The colonies in the Americas continued to send silver and gold, but corruption and war debts drained it before it could reach Madrid. The once mighty armadas were in ruins. Spain would never again command the world as it had under Charles V or Philip II. For the Habsburgs, the treaties marked a humbling descent. They retained their Austrian lands and acquired new territories, but the myth of divine destiny had shattered. No longer the unquestioned masters of Europe, they had become one power among many, a relic of an age when kings believed their blood made them gods. The dynasty continued in Austria for another 2 centuries, but the shadow of decline hung over every generation. In the grand halls of Vienna, portraits of past emperors still looked down with their proud, identical faces, the same protruding chins, the same heavy jaws. They seemed to watch silently as their descendants tried to salvage what was left of the empire. The lesson was carved into their lineage: blood alone could not hold a throne. As for Spain, the people had mixed feelings about their new Bourbon king. Some saw him as a fresh start after centuries of Habsburg stagnation. Others mourned the loss of the dynasty that had once made their nation the most powerful on earth. But few could deny that something fundamental had ended. The age of divine kings, of bloodlines untouchable by reason or science, was fading into the past. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs was more than the end of a family, it was the end of an idea. For centuries, they had believed that their lineage was chosen by God, that their blood carried the right to rule. Yet in the end, it was that same blood, tainted by pride and isolation, that brought them down. No sword, no revolution, no rival kingdom destroyed them. Biology did. The War of the Spanish Succession had shown Europe a new truth: power could no longer rest on blood alone. Nations would rise and fall not by divine right, but by diplomacy, industry, and reason. The world was changing, and the Habsburgs, bound by the ghosts of their ancestors, were left behind. The bells that tolled for Charles II in 1700 had not just mourned a king, they had marked the death of an empire and the dawn of a new age. When the cannons finally fell silent and the treaties were signed, Europe was no longer the same. The War of the Spanish Succession had ended not only the Spanish Habsburg line but the illusion that power could be preserved forever through blood alone. The world that rose from the ashes of that conflict was a world beginning to awaken, a world where politics, science, and reason were slowly replacing faith and divine right. Yet the Habsburgs, though wounded, were not entirely gone. In Austria, their legacy endured, fragile but stubborn, like an ancient oak hollowed by centuries of storms. The Austrian branch of the family now carried the burden of a name that once commanded fear and reverence. Under Emperor Charles VI, the Habsburgs still ruled vast lands: Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of Italy, but their reach was no longer global. The Spanish colonies, the oceans, and the golden fleets of empire were lost. What remained was an empire of mountains and memories, still magnificent, but increasingly out of step with a changing world. Charles VI, though ambitious, faced the same haunting problem that had plagued his ancestors: the question of succession. His marriage to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel produced no surviving sons, only daughters. Determined to preserve his dynasty, Charles issued the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713, a legal decree that would allow his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit his throne. He spent the rest of his reign persuading other European powers to recognize it, a costly diplomatic campaign that drained his treasury and left his empire vulnerable. When Charles died in 1740, the ink on those treaties was barely dry. Within months, the wolves were at the door again. Rival kings and ambitious ministers saw an opportunity in the Habsburgs' weakness. Prussia invaded Silesia, France and Bavaria plotted to seize Austrian lands, and another great war, the War of the Austrian Succession, erupted. Once again, the empire that had been built through marriage was forced to fight for survival through blood and steel. But something new emerged from this chaos: Maria Theresa herself. Against all expectations, she proved to be one of the most capable rulers the Habsburgs had ever produced. Young, intelligent, and unyielding, she took command of her divided empire with the same quiet ferocity that had once driven her ancestors to marry nations together. She reorganized the government, reformed the army, and rebuilt the economy. She ruled not through superstition or divine right, but through reason, discipline, and the will to endure. Her reign marked the beginning of the Habsburgs' slow transformation, from a dynasty of warriors and priests into one of administrators and reformers. Yet even in this age of enlightenment, the shadows of the past lingered. The family still clung to its traditions, its hierarchies, and its belief in the sanctity of its blood. The genetic scars of centuries of inbreeding did not vanish overnight. Infant deaths remained common in the family, and physical frailty still haunted many of its members. Maria Theresa's marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine brought new blood into the line, a necessary infusion after centuries of genetic isolation. Their union produced 16 children, including the ill-fated Marie Antoinette, who would later become Queen of France and lose her head to the guillotine. Through this marriage, the Habsburgs transformed into the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, preserving their name but blending it with fresh lineage. It was, perhaps, the only thing that saved them from total extinction. The Enlightenment swept across Europe, challenging the old order. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau mocked the pretensions of royalty. Scientists began to explain the mysteries of heredity and biology that had once been attributed to divine will. The Habsburgs, who had once believed themselves chosen by God, now ruled in an age that increasingly believed in reason instead. Yet they adapted, as they always had. They sponsored universities, patronized the arts, and positioned themselves as enlightened monarchs defending stability in a world of revolution. Still, fate had not finished testing them. Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II, took the throne with dreams of modernizing his empire even further. He abolished serfdom, curtailed the power of the church, and sought to turn the Habsburg realm into a rational, efficient state. But his reforms met fierce resistance, and his empire, too vast and too divided, strained under the weight of change. When he died childless, it was his brother, Leopold II, and later his nephew, Francis II, who inherited the crown. Francis II would face a challenge unlike any the dynasty had ever known: Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution had shattered the idea of divine monarchy, and Napoleon's rise brought that revolution to Europe's doorstep. The Holy Roman Empire, the institution the Habsburgs had dominated for centuries, crumbled under the pressure. In 1806, Francis was forced to dissolve it, declaring himself instead Emperor of Austria. It was a symbolic end to an era. The empire of faith and family had given way to the empire of modern nationhood. Yet somehow, the Habsburgs endured. Through wars, revolutions, and defeats, they remained on the throne of Austria for more than a century after the fall of the Spanish line. Their ability to survive was uncanny, a mix of pragmatism, diplomacy, and sheer inertia. But beneath the surface, the same contradictions remained: an obsession with tradition in an age that demanded progress, a belief in divine order in a century ruled by science. By the late 19th century, the empire had become a patchwork of nationalities and languages: Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Italians, and many more, all bound uneasily under the double crown of Austria-Hungary. The Emperor Franz Joseph I, who ruled from 1848 to 1916, embodied both the endurance and the tragedy of his house. He was disciplined, dignified, and utterly trapped by the weight of his ancestors. His life was marked by loss. His brother was executed in Mexico after a failed attempt to create a Habsburg monarchy in the Americas. His wife, the beloved Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, was assassinated by an anarchist. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, committed suicide at Mayerling in a scandal that shook the empire. Each tragedy seemed to echo the same old refrain: power without happiness, blood without peace. And then came the final act. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's nephew and heir, in Sarajevo set off a chain of events that plunged the world into the First World War. The conflict that followed would destroy empires: Russian, Ottoman, German, and finally, Habsburg. After centuries of outlasting every rival, the dynasty that had once ruled half the world collapsed under the weight of modernity. When the war ended in 1918, the last emperor, Charles I, abdicated and went into exile. Austria-Hungary was dissolved, carved into new republics and nations. The once mighty Habsburg crown was packed away, a relic of a vanished age. And yet, their story endures, not only in palaces and portraits but in the lessons they left behind. The Habsburgs' rise and fall stand as one of history's most profound warnings. They showed how ambition can build an empire but arrogance can destroy it, how power can corrupt not only politics but biology itself. Their obsession with bloodline purity created a dynasty that conquered the world, only to be conquered by its own DNA. From a fortress in Switzerland to the throne of Spain, from the glory of empire to the silence of exile, the Habsburgs' journey mirrors the human struggle itself, the desire to control fate, the fear of loss, and the inevitable truth that nature always has the final word. No crown, no bloodline, no divine decree can escape it. In the end, what destroyed the Habsburgs was not their enemies, but the very idea that they were more than human. Centuries after their rise, the Habsburgs remain one of history's most haunting dynasties, a name spoken with both awe and pity, their story echoing across the corridors of power, medicine, and myth. Their empire has vanished, their crowns long locked away behind museum glass, yet their legacy continues to fascinate because it reveals something profoundly human. It is the story of how brilliance and blindness can coexist, how the hunger for control can lead to self-destruction, and how even the mightiest rulers cannot escape the quiet laws of nature. In the centuries since their fall, scientists, historians, and geneticists have studied the Habsburgs not only as a royal family but as a biological case study, the ultimate warning of what happens when human ambition collides with the mathematics of heredity. The same power that once built cathedrals, funded explorers, and reshaped Europe also created one of the most famous examples of genetic decline in recorded history. And at the center of it all was the unshakable belief that their blood was sacred. Modern genetic research has put numbers to the tragedy. In 2009, Spanish scientists led by Dr. Gonzalo Alvarez published a groundbreaking study analyzing 16 generations of the Habsburg family tree, over 3,000 individuals across 2 centuries. Their conclusion was staggering. The family's systematic inbreeding had pushed their genetic diversity to catastrophic lows. The average Habsburg prince or princess had an inbreeding coefficient higher than that of the offspring of siblings. In Charles II of Spain, that coefficient reached an almost impossible 0.254, a living mathematical proof that no amount of wealth or power can overrule biology. The study revealed what history had always hinted at: the dynasty's infertility, deformities, and mental instability were not curses or divine punishments but the predictable results of genetic repetition. The so-called Habsburg jaw, the protruding lower mandible seen in portraits for generations, was just one outward sign of a deeper collapse within. It became the physical emblem of a dynasty trapped by its own myth. But the Habsburg story is not just one of degeneration, it's also one of adaptation. Despite centuries of decline, the family showed a strange resilience. When the Spanish branch died out, the Austrian line survived by sheer willpower, reform, and luck. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe modernized, the Habsburgs transformed themselves from medieval monarchs into bureaucratic rulers, administrators, and diplomats. Their empire no longer ruled the seas or the Americas, but it managed to govern a complex web of peoples and nations for nearly 200 more years. This endurance fascinates historians as much as their downfall. How could a dynasty so biologically weakened last so long politically? The answer lies in their adaptability. They learned to wield bureaucracy where swords had failed, to balance nationalities with careful diplomacy, and to survive revolutions by conceding just enough power to maintain the illusion of unity. Even as science and progress reshaped Europe, the Habsburgs held on, stubbornly symbolic of the old world's grandeur. Yet, in a cruel twist, their biological and political fates mirrored one another. Just as inbreeding had narrowed their gene pool, their empire's obsession with control narrowed its social and political flexibility. The Austrian Empire became a mosaic of restless nations held together by decrees and tradition rather than shared purpose. Each new uprising, Hungarian, Italian, Czech, was like another genetic flaw emerging from centuries of internal confinement. By the early 20th century, the empire, like the bloodline, could no longer sustain itself. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 was more than a spark for the First World War, it was the final echo of a dynasty that had spent centuries defying the inevitable. When the war ended in 1918, the Habsburg Empire disintegrated into a dozen new nations. Emperor Charles I, the last to wear the crown, abdicated quietly and went into exile, still clinging to the belief that divine order would one day restore his family. He died a few years later, penniless and exiled on the Portuguese island of Madeira, whispering prayers to the same God his ancestors had invoked to justify their power. The line that once ruled most of Europe now ruled only memory. But memory can be powerful. Even today, the name Habsburg carries a strange weight. The palaces they built, the Hofburg in Vienna, Schönbrunn, El Escorial, Madrid's royal palace, still stand as silent witnesses to a dynasty that once shaped continents. Tourists walk through their gilded halls without realizing they are walking through the anatomy of power itself, grand rooms built on fragile foundations, beauty masking decay. In museums and history books, the Habsburgs have become a paradox, icons of splendor and symbols of downfall, both divine and deeply flawed. Their portraits, painted by masters like Velázquez and Titian, show regal faces gazing proudly from centuries past. Yet look closer, and the illusion cracks. The drooping chin, the hollow eyes, the faint sadness in their expressions, they tell a different story, one of exhaustion and inevitability. Geneticists often call the Habsburg saga a natural experiment, a tragic example of how isolated populations, whether royal families, remote communities, or endangered species, suffer when diversity is lost. But to view them only through the lens of biology is to miss their deeper meaning. The Habsburgs are not just a case study in genetics, they are a mirror for the human condition. Their rise and fall reflect our timeless desire to control what cannot be controlled, to believe that through will, faith, or status, we can defy the limits set by nature itself. In this sense, the Habsburgs were not just rulers, they were symbols of humanity's eternal struggle against its own fragility. Their empire was built on the idea of permanence, eternal bloodlines, eternal faith, eternal order. But life is never permanent. Kingdoms crumble, bloodlines end, and even the most powerful families are reduced to stories. The Habsburgs' true legacy, then, is not their castles or crowns, it is the lesson that everything in nature, even greatness, must evolve or perish. Today, distant descendants of the Habsburgs still live quietly in Austria, Hungary, and beyond. They no longer rule, but some still carry the titles, archdukes, archduchesses, ghostly echoes of what once was. They attend charity galas, write books, and appear in documentaries, living reminders of a lineage that shaped Europe and paid the price for its own myth. None of them bear the famous Habsburg jaw anymore. Centuries of outbreeding have softened the features, washing away the visible traces of the dynasty's genetic curse. In their faces, the past seems to have healed, proof that time and adaptation can mend even the deepest wounds. In classrooms and laboratories, the story continues to be told. Biology students learn of the Habsburg coefficient as a cautionary tale of what happens when isolation replaces diversity. Historians discuss the dynasty's collapse as a turning point between medieval divine order and the modern world of nation-states. And storytellers, filmmakers, and artists return to them again and again, not just because of their crowns and wars, but because their story feels universal. The Habsburgs remind us that all power is temporary. That wealth, faith, and privilege cannot rewrite the code of life. That behind every monument, every empire, and every name carved into history lies the same truth: we are all subject to nature's quiet arithmetic. It does not care for titles or thrones, it cares only for balance. So when we look upon the portraits of Charles V, Maria Theresa, or Charles II, the faces painted in gold and shadow, we are not just looking at the past. We are looking at ourselves. The same ambition, the same pride, the same yearning to be more than human still lives within us. And perhaps that is the final irony of the Habsburgs: their story did not end with them. It continues wherever human beings seek to master what cannot be mastered, and wherever the arrogance of power collides with the laws of nature. In the end, the dynasty that once believed its blood was eternal left behind a truth more enduring than any crown: nothing is eternal except change. The story of the Habsburgs does not end in the crumbling palaces of Vienna or the silence that followed their exile. It lingers, an echo through time, a reminder that power, no matter how divine it claims to be, is always temporary. The dynasty's 6th-century reign left behind more than art, architecture, and political borders. It left a cautionary tale carved into both history and human biology, a story that continues to teach long after the last emperor's crown was set aside. In the centuries that followed their fall, the world changed beyond recognition. Monarchies gave way to republics. Faith yielded to science. Empires fractured into nations. But the fascination with the Habsburgs never faded, perhaps because their story encapsulates everything humanity strives for, and everything it must fear. They were builders and destroyers, visionaries and victims, symbols of both civilization's triumph and its hubris. Their rise from a modest Swiss fortress to the rulers of half the world feels almost mythical, but their downfall was painfully human. In the modern era, the name Habsburg carries a dual weight. It represents not only the grandeur of Europe's past but also its darkest lessons about ambition and isolation. Historians still marvel at their longevity. Scientists still study their genetics. Artists still find tragedy in their portraits. Their saga stands as a bridge between two worlds, the medieval belief in divine destiny and the modern understanding of biological truth. As genetic science advanced, researchers began to see in the Habsburgs' downfall a reflection of the same principles that govern all life. The dynasty's obsession with purity and inheritance mirrored patterns observed in isolated animal populations, endangered species, and even small human communities. Without diversity, strength decays. Without variation, survival fades. The empire that once believed its bloodline was sacred became the perfect proof that nature demands balance above all else. In 2019, a team of researchers recreated three-dimensional models of the Habsburg jaw using portrait measurements and genealogical data. The results were both fascinating and unsettling. They showed a steady progression of facial deformity across generations, culminating in Charles II, whose features were almost caricature-like in their extremity. But more than anatomy, what those reconstructions revealed was a timeline of human arrogance, a visual record of how power can trap a family in its own myth. And yet, despite everything, the Habsburg legacy is not only one of decay. There is also something strangely noble in their persistence. They endured wars, plagues, revolutions, and the rise of modern democracy. Even after losing their crowns, they adapted. Members of the family served as soldiers, diplomats, and scholars. Some fought against fascism during World War II. Others became patrons of the arts or advocates for European unity. They no longer ruled nations, but they remained part of the continent's cultural DNA, a living echo of its past. One of the most poignant images of this transformation came in 1989, when Otto von Habsburg, the eldest son of the last emperor, stood on the border between Austria and Hungary as it opened for the first time since the Iron Curtain had been erected. The man whose ancestors once ruled both nations watched as hundreds of people crossed freely, no longer subjects of an empire but citizens of a new Europe. Otto smiled. "If my father were alive," he said, "he would be proud, not because the empire has returned, but because freedom has." It was a statement that symbolized a final evolution. The dynasty that once embodied divine monarchy had come to represent reconciliation. Today, the Habsburg name endures not as a political power but as a cultural symbol. Their story continues to inspire novels, documentaries, and films. Museums across Europe, from Madrid to Vienna, preserve their artifacts not as relics of conquest, but as windows into the fragility of human ambition. Tourists walk through Schönbrunn Palace or the Hofburg and see golden mirrors, jeweled crowns, and marble halls. Yet behind the beauty lies an invisible narrative. Every portrait and crest, every chandelier and staircase, whispers of a lineage undone by its own perfectionism. The deeper one studies their history, the more it feels like a moral allegory disguised as a dynasty. The Habsburgs believed they were chosen by God, that their blood was unique, their rule eternal. In reality, they were human, bound by the same laws as everyone else. Their tragedy was not in being cursed but in refusing to believe they could be fallible. And that refusal, passed down from one generation to the next, became their undoing. The lesson is universal. Across time, societies and leaders have repeated the same mistake, believing that greatness is inherited rather than earned, that purity is strength rather than weakness. The Habsburgs are the most famous example, but their story plays out in countless forms, in isolated communities that collapse from within, in ideologies that exalt superiority and end in ruin, in human attempts to control what cannot be controlled. In this way, the dynasty's end feels almost poetic. Their downfall coincided with the dawn of a scientific age, the very age that would explain what they could not. Where the Habsburgs saw divine destiny, modern genetics saw probability. Where priests once saw curses, scientists saw chromosomes. The same truth that destroyed their empire also helped humanity understand itself. And still, the fascination endures. Because beyond the science, there is emotion. The image of a pale, fragile Charles II struggling to speak, or of Maria Theresa standing defiantly before her court, or of Emperor Charles I watching his empire dissolve into fog, these are not just historical figures. They are mirrors of our own fragility, our own longing to build something that lasts forever. The Habsburgs remind us that even the most powerful among us are, in the end, temporary caretakers of what time allows. Walk through Vienna today and you will still feel their presence. The imperial eagle still adorns buildings. Their music still echoes in the waltzes of Strauss, their legacy lingers in the architecture that defines the city. But it is no longer a symbol of dominance, it is a monument to endurance, to the bittersweet beauty of impermanence. In an age obsessed with legacy, the Habsburgs offer a final paradox, that true immortality comes not from bloodlines or empires, but from the lessons left behind. They ruled for 600 years, and in their rise and fall, they demonstrated the full spectrum of human nature, ambition, faith, pride, intelligence, and vulnerability. Their story outlasted their empire because it belongs to everyone. Perhaps that is why, centuries later, we still return to them, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. The Habsburgs are us, magnified through the lens of history. They dreamed of eternal power, and they paid the price. We dream of progress and perfection, and the same warning still applies. Power without humility becomes poison. Purity without diversity becomes decay. In the final reckoning, the Habsburgs' greatest legacy is not a crown or a palace, but a truth whispered across time, that no dynasty, no empire, and no human being is beyond the reach of nature's balance. Their rise was written in ambition, but their fall was written in their genes, a reminder that the same forces that build greatness can just as easily unmake it. And so the story of the Habsburgs ends not in triumph, but in reflection. The empire is gone, the thrones are empty, but the lesson remains eternal. Power is fleeting, blood is mortal, and time is the only true monarch.